Was the Messiah supposed to suffer based on any prophecies of the Hebrew Bible? Modern scholars say no, pretty much unanimously. Yet the New Testament seems to spend a fair amount of time trying to prove this very thing to first century Jews, who also didn't seem to know about it. Let's consider whether there was any indication of a suffering Messiah in the Hebrew Bible, or if this was a novelty of the first century. Luke 24 says, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" So Luke obviously thinks that the idea of a suffering servant is a major part of the Hebrew Bible. The Gospel of Mark also spends a fair amount of time indicating that the Messiah was supposed to suffer, according to prophecy, and seems to suggest that the Jews were blind to this fact. Well, were they blind because their scripture, what we call the Old Testament, didn't mention it, as modern scholars mostly seem to agree on? Or were Mark and Luke actually getting this idea from earlier biblical authors who originally intended such a concept? Let's see. And by the way, I'm not going to argue that the New Testament writers were completely correct in all their understanding of scripture. I just want to see which Hebrew scriptures they were potentially pulling their interpretations from. There are several texts in Isaiah which Christians interpreted as showing that the Messiah would suffer, even sometimes as a servant. The most famous one is Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12. But this position is almost universally and staunchly contested by virtually all secular scholars, and even some Christian ones, despite the explicit application of the passage to Jesus in multiple New Testament passages. This view against applying this passage to the Messiah contends that Isaiah 52:13 through chapter 53 is actually speaking of Israel herself, especially considering that the context of the surrounding passages is the restoration of Israel. We'll come back to the debate about Isaiah in a moment. God's chastisement of the sons of David is made quite explicit, even making him God's own son who will build a house for God. Let's read 2 Samuel 7:12 through 15. "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you." This language seems to apply well to Solomon, who built a house for the Lord, except when was he punished with floggings? It probably also applies to later reformer kings who renovated God's house, yet still suffered at the hands of the nations, especially Josiah. Yet I would argue that the writer is living in the post-exilic period, writing with the various messianic motifs of sons of David found in that history of Samuel and Kings, but also looking forward to some future Messiah. Thus, contrary to what many secular scholars contend, we seem to have prophetic language which clearly refers to both the Davidic Messiah and not only suffering, but specifically flogging. Of course, the final kings of Judah did in fact suffer at the hands of their captors, and this could be all that 2 Samuel is trying to explain. But some of the New Testament writers did not think that this was the end of the story, and I'm going to argue that even some of the authors of the Hebrew Bible held this view. Isaiah is often called the Messianic prophet, but I believe another prophet who could rightfully be called this is Zechariah. Zechariah 12:10 says, "I will pour out a spirit of grace and supplication on the house of David and those who inhabit Jerusalem, so that when they look on me whom they have pierced, they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and bitterly cry over him as one cries over a firstborn." Notice here the combination of both judgment on the house of David and on Israel. This conflation will be important when we come back to Isaiah. There are a few other passages which are interpreted by Christian apologists as indicating a suffering servant. This one in Zechariah seems to be one of the most explicit connections of what I argue is a soteriological literary motif of the rulers of Jerusalem in the narrative of the Torah and the Deuteronomistic history that continues through the histories of the kings as quote-unquote shadows of the coming Messiah, if I may borrow Hebrews terminology. I detailed these connections in my previous book by analyzing what I believe are intentionally repeated details for all the rulers of Jerusalem, especially Adonizedek and Absalom. In Zechariah's understanding of this motif, it associates the house of David with someone, in the first person even, whose side will be pierced, and the mourning for a firstborn, which is at least reminiscent of the account of the death of Absalom, son of David. Genesis 3:15 is also used to try to show that the Messiah was expected to be a suffering servant. In this prophetic story, the son of a woman will experience the serpent's bruising of his heel, but he will in turn bruise the serpent's head. What this means is not explained by the author of Genesis, but it certainly seems to fit into the Deuteronomistic soteriology that spans the histories of the Bible, a history where historical details are in fact pregnant with prophetic meaning. Psalm 22 had the tradition attached to it that it was written by David and can only be taken as messianic if you assume it has a dual nature, which, as we've seen in a previous lesson, is very much not unprecedented throughout the Bible. I would argue that within the passage itself, our author is tying future messianic hopes to whatever these details of suffering are supposed to represent, as he speaks of the nations coming to worship Yahweh, which many prophets associate with a future Davidic Messiah, even and especially in the post-exilic period. And this is true even if these sufferings are also tied to the suffering of Israel herself, a conflation that once again we'll see in a moment when we come back to Isaiah. As I covered in a previous lesson, Daniel 9 mentions that the prince would be cut off, which quite possibly refers to a high priest who was killed in the 2nd century BC, which is detailed in 2 Maccabees 4. In my book and in previous lessons in this series, I cover various ways that both the priestly and Davidic hopes of Israel manifest in the various post-exilic books, especially in Nehemiah, Zechariah, and Ezra, where Zerubbabel is the last Davidic descendant mentioned, and the term the branch, used in Isaiah 11 and Jeremiah for a future son of David, is also used for the priest Joshua. The use of the term prince in Daniel 9:26 is yet more evidence for conflation or perhaps even replacement of the Davidic for priestly messianic views. And here we have not only a priest who suffers, but who is also killed. It's easy to see how apocalyptic-minded Jews of the 1st century could take this passage and apply it to Jesus or one of the many other men who claim to be messiahs within a very short time period. See my book for more on this. In a later lesson, I'll explain how Jews could be and often were so creative with their texts, using historical narrative to couch prophetic messages, both for understanding their own time, especially the post-exilic perspective, and the future, for which they still maintain faith that God will eventually make good on his covenants. Let's now return to Isaiah. Although we cannot fully cover this topic here, allow me to reiterate that this is not merely a matter of properly interpreting, for example, Isaiah 53, a text in isolation. I've seen both fundamentalists and unbelieving scholars make the same literalist mistakes of nailing down conclusions based on single passages, without taking into account the incredible web of intertextual theologies and literature that comprise the Hebrew Bible. I illustrated an example of this in chapter 2 of my book, when considering whether Hosea's son called out of Egypt could refer to the Messiah. The New Testament application of this passage to Christ actually fits into Old Testament motifs and does not exclude the obvious application to Israel herself. And I'll also argue that the New Testament authors concluding that Isaiah 53 spoke of the Messiah as the suffering servant does not preclude them from also believing that Israel herself was also being spoken of within the same prophetic language. Once again, I'm not taking sides, but I think arguments against Isaiah 53 speaking of the Messiah should fully take into account the mystery that authors like Mark espoused, even following the ancient tradition of the interplay of literary motifs of the Hebrew Bible. So far, even the most credentialed biblical scholars that I've encountered have not even mentioned the idea of mystery in their entire discussion of the topic, or even the overlap of meaning of prophetic motifs. I'll further develop the idea of how the biblical writers intentionally use mystery, even sometimes by their own admission, when we get to the greatest mysteries of all in this series on how Jesus became God. And Isaiah itself does in fact contain a few details that would make you wonder if the apocalyptic author was trying to couch a mystery in the more explicit, obvious context of the passage being about Israel. In 52:8, there's the hope of the return of the Lord's presence to Zion, something that they had lost as explained in Lesson 3 of this series, when God left Israel. Isaiah also says that all the nations would see the Lord's salvation in their exodus from exile. And then, beginning in verse 13, the switch is made to the singular servant. He would be the one to sprinkle the nations, and kings would shut their mouths before him. Chapter 53 is an unfortunate man-made break in the passage, as chapters were added in the Middle Ages. He was despised and rejected by men, and a man of sorrows and grief. Then Isaiah says something really interesting beginning in verse 4. He has borne not just the sins of the nations, but our griefs, and was pierced for our transgressions. This is not just Israel offering sacrifices for the nations, but someone who becomes a sacrifice, including for Israel herself. Quote, Yahweh has laid on him the iniquity of us all. End quote. Some various details are given which the New Testament writers do not fail to play off of, such as that he opened not his mouth before his oppressors, and his grave was made with the rich. But I think the clincher is the final verse. Isaiah says that this individual now makes intercession for the transgressors. This particular task stretches all the way back into the soteriological motifs of the Deuteronomistic history to such important figures as Moses and Abraham. For modern scholars to argue that Isaiah 53 can't be speaking about the Messiah because it does not use the term, one has to totally ignore how this passage fits into the soteriology of the Hebrew Bible, with whom it frequently and almost explicitly associates the Davidic Messiah, including in the book of Isaiah itself and other chapters. So now we turn to an even more interesting topic than conflations of the suffering servant motif with Israel's messianic hopes. And that is, how could the Messiah be somehow divine, and was there any indication of this in the Old Testament, without projecting later New Testament interpretations onto it? The answer to how monotheistic Jews could give birth to Christ worship may surprise you in the next series.